The year is 1996. With the release of Nintendo's first ever 3D console, well-established series like Mario or Zelda made their first steps into the three-dimensional room and are still praised how effortless the transition seemed to work. It wasn't long before other franchises would follow their tracks and either build on already existing concepts or take their time to catch up one generation later. However, there's one similarity they have all in common, no matter how long one of them might have taken. They all made the shift reasonably successful. With so many great examples and opportunities to get inspired, there was still one little guy who refused to make the cut. Instead of using this new powerful hardware, he concentrated on what has worked in the past and delivered a solid experience without impressing anyone at that time. Of course, I refer to Yoshi, who wasn't as eager as other games and to this day refuses to leave the second dimension. And there's also Kirby, which might be more of a fitting topic to discuss on this channel. Just like I said, Kirby 64 The Crystal Shards was the debut of the pink ball on the Nintendo 64 and unlike other series didn't feel quite like ready to gain new heights. Although the game looked like a 3D title, it pretty much played like its predecessors and only used the additional hardware power to feature more detailed backgrounds and a somewhat believable world, with plausible bridges between each level. And while this kind of 2.5D style was certainly a novelty back in the day and kinda special amid all those grand 3D adventures, the idea of a truly three-dimensional Kirby game never left the fans' thoughts. Admittedly, there's no reason to force a game's direction into something the developers have clearly no vision for. There are countless examples of how certain franchises could never either set their feet into 3D, are waiting on another attempt, or still struggle on finding their preferred style. Consequently, the developers behind the Kirby games made the right decision to just hold back and focus on what they know best rather than following trends mindlessly. What seemed like a wasted chance should turn to their favor as 2D platformers gained back their relevancy in the late 2000s and therefore justifying Kirby's preferred dimension again. But after all this time, 4 great conventional Kirby games in a row and the upcoming 30th anniversary, it poses the question, what could possibly come next? What game would differentiate itself enough to not feel like a simple follow-up or stumble into an experimental spin-off territory? In consideration of the unusual long working time the current game takes and certain developer interviews in the meantime, we tell you why the Next Mainline Kirby-Game will be in 3D and go beyond simple reasoning then, well, it's about time. Before we're dipping into the topic, it's important to summarize how the present situation looks like. Star Allies released in 2018 and was the last mainline game up until now. As its predecessors, the game leans heavily on Return to Dreamland's basic structure and expands on it by bringing back the partner feature from Funpack, offering the biggest cast of playable characters to this day. As grandiose as this accomplishment may sound, the rest of the game fell short with only 4 worlds that never mirrored the creative level design from Triple Deluxe or Planet Robobot. In contrast, however, Star Allies adapted to a more modern style of progression and left behind the standard structure of grass, lava or ice worlds in order to show a flexible adventure style where contradictory locations could happen within the same world. Even boss fights benefit from this form of design and actually appear in the middle, at the beginning or whenever it seemed right. Because of that, the game could concentrate on a more propulsive flow, which is why each world aren't even called World 1, 2 or 3 and are rather regarded as chapters. In doing so, Star Allies gave up on long overdue conventions of the genre, while other elements are so lacking in comparison that it's clearly obvious where the main sticking point lay: the short development time. Just 2 years after Planet Robobot's release, they created a full home console title with HD visuals, multiple playable characters and brand new level. Additional content updates did expand the game to some extent, but besides nostalgics and fans, this could not bring people back to start another playthrough. So what was the actual reason to rush out Star Allies in such a short time? If you think about it, all the accomplishments the game gets right seem to function as the basis for the next mainline game. Without a doubt, the graphics are colorful, atmospheric and overall gorgeous, which might have been one of the focus points the team wanted to get right. Leaving aside the loading screens and unclean frame rate, you can clearly get the impression that the developers focused on polishing the visuals as much as possible in order to simply update them in future installments. Eventually, Star Allies is just the foundation for something greater, in a sense an intermediate state intending to act like the foundation for future HD projects. and naturally earned some money. Since then we were only blessed with minor spin-offs that surely didn't take up the whole team just to serve the purpose of simply appetizers meanwhile. Based on the presentation and general controls, it's easy to notice how the groundwork of Star Allies assuredly helped a lot in developing these games as fast as possible, so the thesis seems to at least apply to these spin-offs. Irrespective of what one might think about this kind of practice, the future looks far more interesting than ever before because of this. At the date of the video, Star Allies is basically 3.5 years on the market and we still have not seen even a little teaser for the next main project. At first glance, this attitude is of course commendable. HAL takes their time to create a more satisfying game after some people were disappointed with their last work. But you have to remember that long development cycles should not raise your expectations too much, considering how rocky some Kirby related developments did tend to run. Both Kirby Air Ride and Return to Dreamland started their development one console generation prior to their actual release, and obviously didn't go as smooth as HAL would probably like. They had real problems to release consistently traditional Kirby games for home consoles, and it would take until Return to Dreamland and Epic Yarn until they seemed to get the hang out of it. Since then HAL had a great flow of bringing out platforming games and spin-offs at the same time frequently, so it seems like they overcome the creative block or whatever stopped them back in the day. Until now. Triple Deluxe in 2014, Planet Robobot in 2016 and Star Allies in 2018. There was a consistent 2-year cycle they followed without any variants. What makes this current pause even more interesting is the fact that the visuals should not need much effort and save plentiful time and resources. So if the developers were capable and talented enough to release a full HD project without too many critical downsides just after 2 years, what's taking so long? Which direction a new game could take is in consideration of the genre diversity the franchise is known for rather difficult to say. Yes, it kinda feels like we're in the lucky position to get a new game each year, but you have to consider that these games are often spin-offs and mainline games take their time at least for 2 years. After all, Mario Party does not serve as a substitute for a fully 3D jump and run, which is why Kirby Fighters 2 for example is merely a nice snack in between. Most importantly, this secret mainline Kirby game will soon have a development time of 4 years, nearly matching big budget productions that usually only apply to Nintendo's big hitters like Zelda, Mario or Metroid. And what kind of gameplay is usually fairly complicated, time consuming and money eating to set up? Of course 3D titles. While two-dimensional platformers surely take up their abundant slice of the cake, it's undeniable how simpler they are to create nonetheless. Without the third dimension in mind, you can solely concentrate on the level design and don't have to bother how enemies or the protagonist should behave, which is a point the developers behind HAL are surely aware of. Consequently, they didn't throw themselves in the cold water right from the start and began to experiment with three-dimensional Kirby games at some minor occasions. The first one that springs to mind is the minigame Kirby 3D Rumble, a side mode in Planet Robobot which should only serve as a test to control Kirby in 3D with all the very basic mechanics the series is known for. After that, a short expansion in the form of Kirby's Blowout Blast should follow and release as a standalone game in the eShop of the 3DS. Again, this only enhanced the content we saw in Kirby 3D Rumble, but with the addition of proper boss fights, this shows another little attempt to see how these battles could work in the third dimension. If you think about it, Kirby's Blowout Blast is so basic in its mechanics, it doesn't even feature copy abilities and can be therefore seen as a literal translation of the Kirby formula, or in a sense Kirby's Dreamland 3D. This approach was extremely clever and gave the developers room to really see what functions and what makes no sense. Mario 64's structure was completely different from what we have known from his traditional games, and it should take many years until 3D Land released, a proverbial realization of the 2D Mario gameplay in 3D. So before HAL ventures to make unnecessary missteps, they wanted to see how the fundamental essence of Kirby works in 3D. And if you know how basic Kirby's Dreamland was, then you're probably aware about the missing copy abilities that should came later. Kirby Battle Royale released in 2017 for the 3DS and was the first time we got the chance to see how different well-known power-ups would function apart from their 2D counterpart. Again, the mechanic doesn't really function as in the game, since Kirby does not inhale enemies to gain his powers this time, but we actually see how the at this point flexible movesets of each ability translates to 3D. This is probably also the reason why they chose to build the game based on competitive contest, because they wanted to experiment with the offensive part of Kirby's gameplay and needed a believable justification why Kirby would fight all the time. After that, there were only minor indications found in Star Allies, for example the freely accessible world map and final boss, which was actually a mix between 2D and 3D. Of course, some people are already thinking of other instances where Kirby had some minor appearances in 3D. Essentially speaking, the very first time we got to play as Kirby in 3D was in Kirby Air Ride, where you could leave the vehicle to walk simply on the ground, but this feature had no substance to it and was just in the game to be able to change cars freely on the fly. This also means that the feature was incredibly cool and that we've spent countless hours to just simply walk around the city to explore every corner, but I get ahead of myself. So while there were some weird moments of actual 3D, the real attempt began with Kirby 3D Rumble. These are all the obvious hints towards the next project, but the probably most recent quote-unquote leak that happened during the release of Kirby Fighters 2 last year points out another information with some interesting background. The Twitter user Firubi found some leftover codes in the game that share a folder named Kirby 3D and are up to the standard of the recent mainline games. Even the codes seem to be completely different from blowout blasts, which suggests they maybe don't even use the spin-off as a foundation. I'm not very sure and not very versed in this kind of stuff, but this also adds to the discussion and seems to be no coincidence, especially because a 3D game is so likely. But how would the 3D Kirby in fact look like? Well, if we don't assume blowout blast functions as the basis for the next mainline game, then we have a few possibilities in our hands. 3D platformer does not mean 3D platformer after all, because there are so many who completely differ in their approach. Going by what Kirby has already done, there's the option to portray the gameplay from an aerial view. Therefore everything is laid out in a clear and open way, allowing to base the challenges on the whole screen. Then again, this display of the camera view would be rather limited as well and resemble 2D Zelda, which aren't really regarded as 3D title. Another option is to fully go ambitious and take on a similar route like Super Mario Odyssey. This would also match the long development cycle, and because the level design of Kirby games usually don't focus on traditional platforming at the same time, the exploration based structure of Odyssey would be a perfect fit for the series. Kirby and the Amazing Mirror did something similar as well and orientated itself on Metroid-like games, which was a surprisingly great fit for the typical Kirby gameplay. So while I personally would love to see an Odyssey style Kirby game, since open collectathons are actually my favorite genre, I don't think it will happen. Not because it wouldn't work, but because of how demanding this task would be. It's possible, yes, Mario 64 accomplished this after all, but I cannot see a way where HAL is actually brave enough to strive for this level. So when an open 3D platformer might be too much for the pink ball, then we have to go for something more limiting. And who is more limiting in this level design? Not quality, than Crash Bandicoot. Especially It's About Time showed how the interplay between 3D segments and 2D platforming leads to something completely special and, in a way, an easy first step for a series who tries to dip its toes into the third dimension. Kirby Battle Royale was even perhaps a first glance on what that mix could look like. Some minigames concentrated on the well-established 2D, and by transferring the aerial view style with some 2D passages, the game would get constant perspective changes in order to keep the viewpoint flexible and, at the same time, circumvent the problem of being too limited in perspective, as I mentioned when comparing it to 2D Zelda. Although this could be one of the probable ways to handle the topic, I think they take the safe route and lean more on Super Mario 3D World. Here each level has a clear beginning and end, while still offering some means of exploration to at least some extent. But most important of all is the multiplayer, which is one of the main traits of the series, and it's incorporated whenever it seems right. Playing as Kirby, Meta Knight, DDD and Bandana D in the 3D world style, where each character has its own quirks in order to create different playstyles, seems to just fit perfectly, and the flexible level design of 3D world allows exploration based courses as well as platforming challenges. You could even go one step further and think of possibilities to combine Kirby's gameplay with 3D level design and build worlds that emphasize his characteristics. I'm speaking of more vertical level design, which benefit greatly from Kirby's ability to float and maybe even use this foundation for the premise of the game, like hiking mountains or climbing towers. Kirby Battle Royale did the same as well, and Nintendo in generally is known for creating the gameplay first and forming all the other aspects like story, game world or level design around it. You have to look no further than Triple Deluxe or Planet Robobot, which only had background elements because of the 3D effect, something Star Allies ditched the second there was no effect anymore. Other than that, the developers did their best to hype up their next project in a way they rarely do. In an issue of Famitsu in early 2020, lead action programmer Katsuyoshi Sumitomo stated, "I really want the next thing we create to be called the pinnacle of Kirby games. I'm positive the Kirby series can become even more fun." While the general director Shinya Kumazaki added, "Each entry in the series has its merits, but I want to make something that exceeds previous games." It goes on by Kumazaki saying this year, "And now finally we can move on to the next phase. I still try new things at work every day, talking with my colleagues about where to take the Kirby series next. Together with them, even if only to please a single fan, we are planning for the next stage of our future. The team is a culmination of the best aspects of the Kirby franchise, and we hope you'll look forward to what we have coming next. Pinnacle of the series, next stage of the future, something that exceeds previous games. If those are not brave statements, I don't know. It doesn't happen every day that developers praise their next game to this extent, and while they must be fully aware of creating too many expectations, it seems like they are confident to meet them. It also tells us that the current long development time is not a sign of having trouble with their project like in the past, otherwise they wouldn't take the opportunity to regularly remind us how great the next game is trying to be. The only question that remains is the release date. To be frank, I was sure to see an announcement at the beginning of this year, then at 3D, but both didn't happen. And with the fall September direct in sight, it seems like the perfect opportunity to show the first trailer and start the 30th anniversary next year with a bang, and the first proper 3D title in spring or at the latest summer, fitting the pattern of releasing Kirby games in the first half of the year. Ultimately, this all remains speculation, and the next game could just be another 2D platformer. And although it could be one of the greatest ever created, especially considering how they modernized Star Allies Progress, it would still feel a little anticlimactic. The last 4 Kirby games were all great and at worst just good, but I think it's time to raise the franchise from just being really good to great, to something people talk about outside of the fandom and finally explore new dimensions.